The sound of Martin's palm slamming my reassignment letter onto the glass table still echoes. My team outside froze, whispers ricocheting through the finance floor as he stripped me of authority in the middle of closing payroll for 18,000 employees. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It was designed to break me. But Martin didn't understand what he touched. Payroll isn't just numbers, it's arteries. And one buried clause in that system was already pulsing, waiting. One small trigger was all it would take to turn his empire inside out. Ever been humiliated at work? Comment yes or no, and don't forget to like and subscribe. You'll want to see how this collapse unfolds. Martin, our CFO, waited until payroll Friday to strike. Not Monday, not after close, but the exact morning 18,000 employees expected their deposits. He called me into the glass conference room like it was a casual alignment, but the moment I stepped in, his smile sharpened. He slid a single-page letter across the table, the paper scratching against glass louder than it should have been. Effective immediately, you're reassigned. Payroll operations will transition under my nephew. His voice carried just enough for the finance floor to hear. Heads turned. My team froze mid-keystroke. I felt the humiliation ripple out like a broadcast, designed not just to demote me but to strip away authority I had carried for 12 years. I should have shouted. I should have fought. Instead, I stared at him, the smug tilt of his chin, the deliberate pause as if savoring my silence. Anger flared, but so did something colder. Because he thought this was about power and titles. He thought payroll was just numbers in neat columns. He didn't know payroll was arteries, and he had just jammed a knife into the system's chest. I left the letter on the table, refusing to touch it, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Martin believed he won in that moment, that humiliating me in front of my people had ended my influence. But I knew something he didn't. The structure he relied on was brittle, and buried inside it was one small clause, one overlooked detail, one crack that could bring it all down. Martin strutted away from that glass room as if he had severed my lifeline. But what he never understood was that payroll wasn't his playground. It was a machine I had fortified over a decade, and at its core lay Clause 14C, a line of legal armor buried so deep in executive comp agreements that most people never even knew it existed. Years earlier, I'd insisted on it during a regulatory overhaul. The clause wasn't about me, it was about stability. If payroll execution was disrupted during compliance escalation, the company itself assumed unlimited liability. It was my way of protecting the arteries of the organization from reckless shortcuts. Martin called me legacy staff, a relic, but legacy was exactly what kept the entire structure from bleeding out. When I flagged the clause in a memo weeks before, he laughed, said auditors didn't read footnotes and investors didn't care about fine print. He thought power was headlines, investor calls, and cutting costs on paper. He had no patience for hidden guardrails. What he missed was the way payroll interlocked with everything else: vendor settlements, tax filings, SEC reporting, union contracts. Touch one valve the wrong way, and the entire pipeline pressurized until something burst. I had seen cracks forming long before the day he shoved that letter across the table. Sloppy reconciliations, deferred liabilities shoved into gray accounts, a junior accountant forced to reroute compliance payments through a discretionary line item just to please him. Each of those choices was a splinter in the frame. Clause 14C didn't care about excuses, or charisma, or family connections. It was mechanical. Triggered by timelines and data, immune to ego. And now Martin, in his arrogance, had set the conditions himself by demoting me at the very hour those systems were most exposed. He believed legacy was weakness, that hidden details didn't matter, that silencing me meant stability. But what he called background noise was the quiet hum of the fault line running beneath his empire. One crack in that foundation was already waiting, patient and silent, and it didn't need me to shout or fight. All it needed was his next careless move. The first spark didn't arrive with thunder or headlines. It came in a quiet decision buried in Martin's endless quest to streamline, 2 days after he demoted me, he signed off on a payroll adjustment plan that bypassed my reconciliation protocols, handing authority to his nephew, an accountant so green he still needed to Google tax codes during monthly closes. The change looked harmless. Move overtime payouts into a deferred accrual line to shave expenses off the quarterly books. On paper, it made margins look healthier for the upcoming investor call. In reality, it created a timing mismatch that would echo across compliance ledgers like a loose bolt rattling in an engine. I watched the update from the sidelines, no longer copied on distribution lists, but still tethered to alerts I'd set years earlier. Numbers don't care about reassignments. The system pinged me when entries didn't reconcile. What Martin saw as savings, the software flagged as exposure. Overtime wages are legally protected under federal law. Delaying them by even a single cycle is a violation. Clause 14C was clear. If payroll errors coincided with executive interference and compliance escalation, the liability shifted to the company itself, unlimited. Martin thought he had insulated himself by stripping me of authority, but his fingerprints were all over the override. He had approved the adjustment personally, bypassing counsel, bypassing risk review, and attaching his digital signature at 11:47 p.m., desperate to polish the books before morning. His nephew didn't even realize the gravity. To him, it was just an entry. To Martin, it was a cosmetic fix. To me, it was a lit match brushing against dry tinder. The following morning, small signs appeared. 3 union employees emailed HR about missing overtime hours. A vendor questioned why tax remittances were delayed. A compliance officer flagged a discrepancy in the monthly accrual schedule. Individually, those could have been brushed aside. Collectively, they were proof that the machine was no longer running clean. I documented everything: timestamps, system alerts, email headers, without saying a word. Martin strutted through the office telling directors he had tightened expenses and preserved investor confidence. He believed numbers could be bent like steel. But numbers, like steel, only bend so far before they snap. The trigger wasn't loud yet, but it was set. I could see the lines crossing toward inevitability, the way a storm shows itself first in a sudden stillness. Martin thought demoting me meant my influence ended. He didn't realize he had only removed the human buffer that protected him from the system's teeth. Now the teeth were turning, and they weren't pointed at me. They were pointed at him. The first real fracture appeared not in spreadsheets or board decks, but in the break room. A payroll clerk whispered that her inbox was overflowing with employees asking why their overtime hadn't hit. Normally, those questions got routed to me, and I answered with precision, line by line, closing the gaps before they spread. But with me removed, the questions stacked up like unprocessed claims. Martin brushed them off, saying delays were just part of realigning workflows. To the staff, it sounded like a stall. To the unions, it sounded like negligence. Within 24 hours, HR escalated a complaint about missed deposits. It wasn't public yet, but the silence of those missing paychecks hummed louder than any protest. And behind the scenes, the system itself was showing strain. Deferred overtime accruals meant the liabilities column swelled larger than Martin realized. Vendors who relied on automatic settlements began sending notices. A tax remittance bounced back from the state system, flagged for insufficient funds timing. The numbers weren't wrong. They were angry, demanding to be reconciled. Martin didn't see it. He was too busy preening for the investor update, telling the executive team that efficiencies had saved millions. He presented a slide deck with clean margins, unaware that beneath those bars was a cavity. I kept my distance, but my system alerts didn't. Every mismatch, every missed transfer, every compliance flag hit the archive I had built quietly over years. My documentation grew while his facade hardened. Then came the moment the crack became visible to the wrong audience. A regional manager called HR after 40 employees in her district reported missing wages. One call turned into 2, then 5, then 10. By the afternoon, a compliance officer emailed Martin directly, asking if payroll had been reconciled with regulatory reporting. His reply was dismissive, almost mocking. Noise. We're innovating the process, but the thing about cracks is, they don't stay small. They widen with pressure, And payroll pressure is relentless. By the second day, whispers spread across the company. Managers avoided eye contact in the halls. Directors started quietly asking questions about Clause 14C, a clause most had never heard of, but now saw referenced in internal chatter. Martin sneered at it all, called it paranoia. He didn't realize every denial only deepened the fault line. I watched calmly, not out of detachment, but because I knew what came next. The first crack wasn't just in numbers, it was in trust. Once people stop believing payroll is sacred, every other promise from leadership begins to rot. Martin thought he had silenced me, but really, he had silenced the last person keeping the structure intact. The crack had appeared, and there was no sealing it now. It started with whispers, but whispers turned into noise, and soon the noise became impossible to ignore. By the end of the week, more than 1,000 employees had filed formal inquiries about missing or miscalculated pay. Union representatives who had once been quiet suddenly demanded emergency meetings. The timing was brutal. Martin's quarterly investor presentation was scheduled for the following Monday. What he thought was a temporary shuffle of numbers had mutated into a chain reaction spreading through every corridor of the company. Vendors began sending certified letters warning of breach of contract due to late settlements. The finance hotline, normally a sleepy channel, was lit up like a switchboard in a storm. And the state compliance portal issued a notice. Wage irregularities exceeding reporting thresholds must be disclosed within 10 business days. That was the first spark to catch the board's attention. They didn't hear it from Martin. They heard it from the compliance officer who had grown tired of excuses. He quietly escalated the matter to Janet, the company's legal counsel, who opened her inbox and found a string of ignored warnings, every one of them carrying Martin's initials. Meanwhile, Martin kept striding through the office with forced calm, telling anyone who asked that payroll issues were integration hiccups. But integration hiccups don't cause SEC filings to stall. The ripple spread outward. A major vendor froze deliveries, citing outstanding payments. A union chapter threatened a walkout if overtime wasn't resolved. And then came the moment Martin hadn't prepared for. An analyst on the investor call asked directly why payroll liabilities had ballooned 18% in a single quarter. The line went silent. Martin shuffled his papers, muttered something about temporary adjustments, and moved on. But the damage was done. The market smelled blood. I stayed quiet. Every trigger I had archived over the years was now aligning, data points forming a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as noise. Clause 14C didn't care about excuses. It was designed to activate the moment payroll disruption overlapped with executive interference. Martin's override and his nephew's sloppy entries had created the perfect storm. What looked like efficiency to him looked like liability to regulators. Angela, the external auditor I trusted, called Janet the next morning. She had seen the anomalies and wanted to confirm if Clause 14C was real. Janet hesitated. She knew the answer, but she also knew what it meant. Admitting it meant acknowledging Martin had strapped the company to a bomb with no off switch. Meanwhile, employees were no longer whispering. They were posting. Screenshots of empty pay stubs leaked onto internal forums. A local journalist caught wind of mass payroll irregularities at a national corporation. HR tried to gag the chatter, sending canned responses, but it was like trying to dam a river with tissue. Paper. Each silenced question created 5 more. And in the middle of this chaos, the board convened an emergency session, cloaked in secrecy. The agenda wasn't labeled payroll crisis, it was labeled immediate exposure. That's how you know the storm has arrived, when people stop naming the problem and start naming the damage. Martin still believed he could talk his way out. He thought markets listened to charm, that staff listened to intimidation, that the board listened to projections. But systems don't listen. They obey rules. And the rules he had mocked were now marching toward him with perfect, unrelenting precision. The chain reaction was in motion, and there was no stopping it. The collapse didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with silence, the kind that settles over a boardroom when a truth too large to ignore finally takes its seat at the table. Martin walked in late, shoulders squared, suit sharp, his nephew trailing behind carrying a stack of folders like a loyal shadow. He thought this was just another performance, another chance to talk over problems with buzzwords and borrowed confidence. What he didn't see was the tension in the directors' faces, the way Janet's eyes avoided his, the stack of documents already laid out in front of every board member. The chair cleared his throat. "We need to discuss payroll." That single word cut sharper than any accusation. Martin launched into his usual script, blaming legacy workflows, suggesting delays were temporary, insisting investor confidence remained strong. But halfway through his speech, the general counsel slid a paper across the polished table. It wasn't a market report or a complaint memo. It was Clause 14C, highlighted in fluorescent yellow, Alicia's clause, the one buried deep in the agreements Martin had never bothered to read. The chair asked him to explain. Martin laughed, a brittle sound. "It's boilerplate," he said, waving his hand as though dismissing a nuisance. But Janet spoke next, her voice flat, professional, merciless. "It's not boilerplate. It's enforceable, and it's triggered." She walked them through it, the overtime deferrals, the executive override, the compliance escalation already logged. Every condition had been met. Clause 14C was alive, binding, and absolute. Unlimited liability for payroll disruption tied to executive interference, full assumption of damages by the company, no cap, no shield, no escape. The room stilled. Martin's face drained as if someone had pulled the blood from his veins. He turned to his nephew, searching for a lifeline, but the young man stared down at the table, cheeks flushed with shame. The directors whispered among themselves, papers shuffling like dry leaves. The numbers were staggering. SEC penalties, back pay liabilities, vendor breaches, union actions, all compounded, all tied to Martin's decision. He tried one last time, voice cracking now. "We can negotiate. We can smooth this out. But numbers don't negotiate. They stand. They accuse. They expose." Janet closed her folder with a decisive snap. "This is systemic. It's not smoothing. It's collapse." And then came the moment Alicia had anticipated all along. The board turned not to Martin, but to counsel, asking what immediate actions were necessary to contain exposure. The answer was surgical. Suspend Martin pending review. Freeze his access. Notify regulators of proactive compliance engagement. Begin internal audit under external supervision. Within minutes, the vote was cast. Effective immediately, Martin was stripped of authority. His badge was revoked. His nephew excused from payroll. Operations. Security was called not with drama, but with precision. The same precision Martin had mocked when he sneered at oversight. He stood, sputtering about loyalty, about misunderstanding, about betrayal. No one responded. The board members stared at him like a fire already consuming the building, their only task now to cut off fuel. As he was escorted out, his voice echoed down the hall, but it wasn't strong anymore. It was thin, desperate, already fading. And in that quiet aftermath, the directors finally understood the truth Alicia had carried alone for years. Payroll isn't background noise, it's the heartbeat. And when arrogance disrupts the heartbeat, the body doesn't limp, it seizes. Clause 14C wasn't revenge, it was architecture, a safeguard waiting for arrogance to trip it. And Martin, in his blind push for appearances, had tripped it with both feet. The collapse was not dramatic to those outside the room. The markets only saw a delayed filing, a sudden leadership change. But inside they knew. They had looked into the abyss created by one man's hubris and one woman's foresight. They had seen how fragile the empire really was, how close it had come to bleeding out, and they would never forget it. The fallout didn't need a headline to feel real. Word spread through the building faster than any press release. Martin was gone, escorted out mid-meeting, his badge deactivated before he reached the lobby. His office door was locked by the afternoon, blinds drawn, nameplate removed with quiet efficiency. Staff who once laughed at his swagger now avoided saying his name, as if speaking it might invite the same fate. In payroll, the panic shifted to relief. Deposits were corrected, overtime restored, and the unions called off their threats within days. But the scars remained. People no longer trusted the system blindly. They whispered about the clause, about Alicia's foresight, though few knew the details. They only knew that someone had protected them when leadership tried to cut corners, and that protection had teeth. The board, desperate to stabilize the company, launched a full review of financial oversight. Janet was elevated, compliance given direct reporting authority, and new guardrails were installed around payroll operations. What Martin had dismissed as legacy was now written into policy as non-negotiable. No one celebrated openly. The culture had shifted too far for champagne or victory laps. Instead, there was a wary silence, the kind that lingers after a near disaster, when everyone understands just how close the system came to failing. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I walked out each evening with the calm certainty that arrogance had been punished and fragility exposed. My name wasn't on the announcements, but it didn't have to be. The aftermath spoke for itself. In the weeks that followed, I learned that collapse doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in the background, reshaping everything without a sound. Martin's name vanished from company communications, replaced with sterile phrases like leadership transition and ongoing review. Investors treated it like a course correction. Employees treated it like justice whispered into the walls. And I, Alicia, carried on without spectacle. I never wanted headlines or applause. What I wanted was proof that arrogance could not bulldoze the systems built to protect people. Clause 14C had been my insurance, not for myself, but for the thousands who relied on every deposit, every settlement, every calculation landing on time. The lesson wasn't revenge. Not really. It was fragility. A company that looked unshakable fell to its knees because one man thought details were beneath him. Payroll is not detail. It is lifeblood. You cut it, everything else collapses. I left the corporation soon after, quietly, with no farewell speech or LinkedIn post. I didn't need to remind anyone of what had happened. The system itself had carried the message. Ignore the safeguards, and the house burns from within. Years of silence had felt heavy at times, but in the end, silence was the sharpest weapon. It let the fault line show itself, let the arrogance of one man do all the work. And when it broke, I stood steady, not as a victim, not even as a victor, but as the reminder that rules are written for a reason. I walked away knowing this truth. Systemic collapse doesn't need fury, it only needs pressure. And pressure always finds the weakest point. When I look back, what stays with me isn't the humiliation in that glass room or even Martin's downfall. It's the reminder that systems people believe are unbreakable often collapse from the smallest ignored detail. Payroll wasn't just paperwork. It was the heartbeat of an entire corporation. And when arrogance cut into that heartbeat, the entire body seized. That's the real lesson. Revenge isn't about clever tricks or loud gestures. It's about letting fragility reveal itself. One overlooked clause, one dismissed warning, one quiet trigger can unravel an empire built on ego. Today's corporate world moves fast, but fragility hides in the rush. We've seen banks topple, tech giants stumble, and household names tank because someone waved off a minor issue. This story proves that when leaders ignore the guardrails, collapse isn't a question of if, it's when. If you've ever been silenced, overlooked, or mocked for pointing out a flaw, I want you to feel validated. Those observations matter. The very thing someone rolls their eyes at might be the crack that saves others when arrogance pushes too far. The takeaway is simple. Document everything. Small flags, strange inconsistencies, ignored procedures. Write them down, keep records, and know that truth has power. Fragility isn't always obvious until pressure builds, and then it's too late to rewind. How to get started today. 1. Write down small concerns, even if they feel unimportant. 2. Save proof. Emails, memos, timestamps become your shield. 3. Don't argue with arrogance. Let the facts speak when the cracks appear. 4. Remember, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen a company ignore a small issue that turned into something big? Comment below, share your story, and don't forget to subscribe. These lessons matter,